Wraith was 65 pounds of organized violence, and in the 4 months since his discharge from Naval Special Warfare Command, he had hospitalized 2 men and reduced an entire facility staff to walking sideways past his kennel like nervous sentries. The Iron Ridge Canine Recovery Center in Fayetteville, North Carolina, was built specifically for dogs like him, dogs that the military had weaponized so thoroughly that no ordinary shelter could hold them. But even by Iron Ridge standards, Wraith occupied a category of his own. He was a Belgian Malinois, lean and dark-sabled, built like a greyhound with the temperament of a landmine. His left ear had a notch taken from it, shrapnel, according to his service file, and a thin diagonal scar crossed the bridge of his muzzle from a rock face that had caught him during an insertion that went sideways over the Kuna Valley. He had been awarded a service commendation. He had also been discharged following an incident 3 days after his handler's death, in which he had bitten through a 1/4-inch nylon restraint and put his teeth into the forearm of a well-meaning military veterinarian who had simply reached toward his collar. The paperwork that followed was swift and clinical, unfit for reassignment, severe combat-induced behavioral degradation, potential threat to public safety, transfer to Iron Ridge pending final evaluation. That evaluation had now expired twice over. Gideon Farr, Iron Ridge's director, had spent 22 years in the Army's military working dog program. He had rehabbed dogs with missing limbs, dogs with blast-induced deafness, dogs that had watched their handlers die in front of them and carried the weight of it silently in every room they entered afterward. He was not a man who frightened easily, but every morning when he walked the isolation corridor and past Kennel 7, he felt the particular cold that only comes when something is looking at you, not with aggression, but with calculation. Wraith didn't bark at Gideon. He tracked him, head low, amber eyes steady, cataloguing every movement with the unhurried deliberation of a predator that hadn't yet decided whether the effort was worth it. "We've extended twice," his senior handler, Kath Emery, had told him on a grey Tuesday morning 2 weeks prior. "The Navy's patience is at 0. If we can't place him in the next 10 days, we're looking at the protocol." Nobody at Iron Ridge said the word euthanasia when they meant Wraith. It felt like an admission they weren't ready to make out loud. Gideon had nodded and said he understood. Then he had driven to a roadside diner outside of Fayetteville, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and stared at the parking lot for 40 minutes. They had tried to place Wraith twice. The first attempt had been Roy Bascom, a retired DEA Canine supervisor out of Charlotte with 26 years of handler experience and a wall full of certificates to prove it. Bascom was a compact, barrel-chested man in his mid-50s who had broken green recruits and hardened suspects with equal efficiency. He arrived at Iron Ridge with a choke collar, a compressed air deterrent, and the specific confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't out-discipline. "I've seen combat dogs come back worse than this," Bascom had said, pulling on a bite sleeve before entering Wraith's outdoor assessment yard. "All they need is firm re-establishment of pack order. You clear that up in the first 10 minutes, you don't have trouble after." Gideon said nothing because there was nothing useful left to say to a man like that, except let him find out himself. Wraith did not bark when Bascom stepped into the yard. He did not pace or posture or throw himself at the perimeter fencing. He stood at the far end of the enclosure with perfect stillness, watching. Bascom crossed the yard with deliberate authority, shoulders back, chin up, projecting the body language of a dominant animal making its case. Wraith waited until Bascom was 8 feet away, then he moved. He didn't go for the padded bite sleeve. He had been trained by Naval Special Warfare Command, and 3 years of operational deployments had given him a comprehensive understanding of protective equipment, and the people who believed it made them safe. He broke left, blew entirely past Bascom's extended arm, and drove his skull into the back of the man's left knee with the full momentum of 65 pounds at sprint speed. Bascom's leg buckled. He went down hard onto the gravel, and before he'd oriented himself, Wraith was standing on his chest, front paws planted on the man's sternum, scarred muzzle 6 inches from his face. He made no sound. He simply waited, with the absolute patience of a dog that had learned to hold positions for hours in the Afghan dark, until 4 staff members and a catchpole managed to separate them. Bascom left with a torn knee ligament, a bruised sternum, and his confidence measurably reduced. He did not return Gideon's follow-up call. The second attempt came 9 days later. His name was Vincent Drum, and he ran a private protection firm out of Raleigh that specialized in high-net-worth clients. Drum believed in what he called environmental conditioning, which Gideon privately thought bore a closer resemblance to psychological warfare. He brought a clicker, a shock collar remote, and a rolled copy of a book he'd written himself about canine behavioral reprogramming. In the yard, Drum moved differently than Bascom. He was slow, deliberate, non-confrontational, crouching low, avoiding direct eye contact, speaking in a measured cadence while clicking the training device in a rhythmic pattern. For roughly 40 seconds, this appeared to be producing results. Wraith had not moved from the far side of the enclosure, and his tail had lowered slightly. Then Drum reached into his vest pocket for a treat, extending his arm palm down, fingers curled slightly, almost exactly replicating the hand position Wraith's handler had used to signal a strike hold. Wraith's training didn't ask him for context, it asked him for pattern recognition. He came off his haunches with no warning at all. He didn't use his teeth, he hit Drum's shoulder first, the same way he'd been trained to take down running targets in full body armor. Momentum and trajectory, not teeth. Drum went airborne, briefly genuinely airborne. He landed flat on his back 5 feet from where he'd been standing, and before he could draw a single full breath, Wraith was standing over him, planted, vibrating with controlled intensity, producing a sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't quite not one either. He held Drum there for 6 minutes. 6 minutes in which the contractor reportedly stopped breathing normally after the first 30 seconds, until Gideon and Kath got a catch pole on Wraith and walked him back to Kennel 7. Drum resigned his interest in the dog via email the following afternoon. After Drum, Gideon made 3 more calls. 2 went unanswered. One listened to the summary, said quietly that he wished them luck and hung up. That had been a Monday. On Friday, Gideon authorized the protocol date, next Thursday morning. He told himself it was a mercy. He wasn't entirely sure he believed it yet. Avery Pennell heard the name Iron Ridge for the first time on a voicemail she almost deleted without listening to. She was 29, a licensed practical nurse at a pediatric outpatient clinic in Knoxville, Tennessee, and she had been moving through the past 5 months in a state that felt less like grief and more like operating underwater. Everything took more effort than it should. Everything arrived at her, slightly muffled. She had stopped listening to the radio in the car because she'd discovered that 3 minutes of quiet was the only thing that made it possible to keep driving without pulling over. Her brother Jace Pennell had been 27 when he died, Petty Officer First Class SEAL Team 6, killed during a direct-action raid in Kunar Province by an improvised device concealed in a doorway he was the first man through. He had been 2 weeks from rotating back to Virginia Beach. He had been the kind of person that rooms rearranged themselves around, loud, ridiculous, and astonishingly capable, with their mother's eyes and a laugh that Avery still heard sometimes at the edge of sleep. He had left behind a 6-year-old daughter named Maisie. Maisie's mother had been gone since she was 3. Jace had raised the little girl on his own between deployments, with a competence that surprised everyone who knew him, because Jace Pennell did not appear, on the surface, to be built for patience. He was built for speed and noise, and throwing himself at problems with full force. But with Maisie, he was different. Unhurried, deliberate. He had a specific voice he used only for her. Lower, steadier, as if something in him went quiet when she came into range. He read to her every night over video call when he was overseas, even when the connection was bad, even when he was exhausted beyond the reach of words. Maisie had not spoken since the morning 2 Navy casualty officers walked up the driveway of Jace's rental in Virginia Beach, where Avery had already been staying. Not a word, not a sound. The pediatric psychologist said it was acute trauma-induced selective mutism, and that the voice would return when the nervous system felt safe again. Avery nodded and said she understood. She did understand, clinically, completely, and understanding it did not make it any easier to watch her niece move through the days like a small, pale ghost who had stopped expecting anything from the world. The voicemail was from a lieutenant at Naval Special Warfare Command who gave his name too quickly for Avery to catch. He said that Jace's military working dog, call sign Wraith, had been transferred to a civilian recovery facility in Fayetteville. He said that Jace's personal effects from the unit, including items that had been attached to Wraith's gear, had also been transferred there. He gave a number. He said she should call if she wanted to arrange retrieval. He did not say anything about the dog's condition, and his tone carried the specific register of military bureaucracy that communicated without stating, "There are things here I am not permitted to tell you." Avery called, Gideon Farr answered. He was honest with her in a way she both appreciated and found difficult to absorb. Wraith was alive. Wraith was not transferable. Wraith had, and here Gideon chose his words carefully, experienced significant behavioral changes since Jace's death, and had proven unresponsive to conventional reintegration methods. He could send Jace's effects by courier, he said. She didn't need to make the drive. "What kind of behavioral changes?" Avery asked. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The kind we see in animals with severe combat trauma," he finally said. "He's not dangerous because he's broken. He's dangerous because he's still operational. He just doesn't have a mission anymore." Avery sat with that. "We're coming in person," she said. "Maisie needs to know Wraith is real, that Jace's life was real, that things he loved still exist in the world somewhere." Gideon said he understood. He said he would have the items ready. He said Wraith's kennel would be fully secured before they arrived. He said this last part twice. They drove down from Knoxville on a Thursday, 1 week before Wraith's protocol date. Avery's Civic ran rough on the highway, and she kept the heat up high because Maisie, who had always run warm, had started getting cold the way grieving people sometimes do, as if the body had quietly reallocated its resources. Maisie sat in the back seat with her knees drawn up and Jace's old unit patch held flat in her lap. A small embroidered SEAL Team 6 insignia, frayed at the edges, that should have looked frightening on a 6-year-old, and somehow only looked like Jace. She'd carried it since the week after the funeral, the way other children carry comfort objects, with a steadiness that implied she was less holding it than using it to hold herself together. Jace had pressed it into her hand at the Knoxville airport before his final deployment. He had crouched to her level and said something that Avery, standing too far away, had not been able to hear. Maisie had nodded once, solemn and enormous-eyed, and put it in her fleece pocket. When the fleece got too small, she moved it to her jeans, then to a small lanyard around her neck. In the back seat, she held it in both hands. Avery drove and did not turn on the radio. Iron Ridge sat on a service road off a county highway south of Fayetteville, behind a chain-link perimeter topped with a single strand of barbed wire. No signs advertising it, no attempt at welcome. It looked like what it was, a containment facility for animals the civilian world did not know how to hold. Gideon met them in the entry office. He was tall and spare, mid-50s, with close-cropped grey hair, and the posture of someone corrected out of slouching too many times to ever do it naturally again. He shook Avery's hand and crouched to Maisie's level and said hello in the way the pediatric psychologist did, without expecting anything back, without making the silence an invitation to fill. Maisie looked at him steadily and said nothing. Gideon set a cardboard box on the counter, inside. Jace's challenge coin, a folded note from his unit, and a battered canvas bandana, desert tan, that had been worn around Wraith's neck throughout his service. The bandana was stiff and dark in places that Avery didn't examine closely. It smelled of the outdoors, of something dusty and distant and final. "I have to tell you," Gideon said, leaning against the counter, looking at Avery directly. "The protocol date is next Thursday. I've been fighting it, but without a viable placement, the Navy has authorized the order. I'm sorry. I wanted you to know." Avery felt the information arrive the way bad news arrived now. Not as shock, but as confirmation of something she had already been half bracing for. "Can we see him?" "I'd strongly advise against it," Gideon said. Not dismissive, his voice carried the weight of a man who had personally watched Wraith take apart two experienced handlers, especially with a child present. "Maisie knew Wraith," Avery said. "Jace had her around him before the last deployment." Gideon looked at Maisie. The little girl had stopped looking at him. She was looking at the door at the far end of the waiting room, a steel-core fire door with a small wire-reinforced window and a placard reading Recovery Wing, Controlled Access. It was propped open 6 inches by a rubber wedge to allow the facility's heating system to circulate through. "We should keep to the office," Gideon began. "I'll get you the transfer forms and—" Maisie slid off her chair. She crossed the waiting area in 10 quiet steps and was through the gap in the steel door before either adult registered what was happening. Avery was moving before she thought about it. Gideon was half a second behind her. They came through the door into a concrete corridor lit by fluorescent tubes, running the ceiling's length. The air changed immediately, colder, sharper, carrying industrial disinfectant, and beneath that something animal and alive and close. The recovery wing had 12 kennels on each side. All but one held dogs that registered the entry with varying degrees of interest. At the far end of the corridor, last kennel on the right, Kennel 7, was reinforced differently from the others. Double-gauge fencing, a secondary bolt above the standard latch, a red laminated placard zip-tied to the mesh, "Caution, barrier aggressive. Do not approach without supervisor." Maisie was already standing in front of it. Avery's heart stopped in the specific way hearts stop, when the thing you feared most has already happened before you could prevent it. She reached for Gideon's arm. Gideon was already in motion, his hand going to the tranquilizer holster on his right hip. But he stopped himself, stopped completely, because of what he was looking at. Wraith was not lunging at the fence. He had been pacing when they entered. Avery could tell from the sound, 3 steps, pivot, 3 steps, but he had gone absolutely motionless the instant Maisie appeared. He stood at the back of the kennel, with his hackles raised in a sharp, dark ridge along his spine, and he watched the small girl in front of his enclosure with an intensity that made Gideon's hand tighten involuntarily around the holster grip. "Don't run," Gideon said, his voice barely above breath. "Don't raise your voice. Any sudden input and he'll react." Avery nodded. Her throat had sealed shut. Maisie stood with her hands at her sides. She was not performing calm. She was simply calm, in the way that young children sometimes are in the presence of animals, before the world has finished teaching them what they're supposed to fear. She raised her right hand and pressed Jace's unit patch flat against the chain-link mesh of Kennel 7. Wraith's nostrils flared. To every human in that corridor, the air held only concrete and disinfectant, and the cold breath coming off the loading bay. To a Belgian Malinois with 300 million scent receptors, it told a different story entirely. Wraith processed it in layers. The child's shampoo, the fabric softener on her jeans, the biochemistry of a small person in calm distress, The traces of highway and the fast food Avery had stopped for 2 hours south of Fayetteville. And then, underneath all of it, embedded deep in the embroidered threads of the patch pressed against the fence, gun oil, the particular brand of peppermint gum that Jace chewed constantly and always carried in the left cargo pocket of his uniform, sweat and Afghan dust, and something that had no name, but that Wraith had been breathing beside for 3 years every day, in heat and dark, and in the wind coming off the mountains. The ridge of hackles along Wraith's spine collapsed. The sound building in his chest, low, pressurized, the frequency that preceded action, hitched and broke apart, dissolving into something that was not a growl at all. Both ears, the scarred left and the intact right, swiveled forward simultaneously. He moved toward the fence in a way he had not moved toward anything in 4 months. Not with strategy, not with calculation, but with something helpless and involuntary, like a compass needle finding north after a long time spinning. He pressed his muzzle through the diamond-shaped gaps in the chain link and breathed. Maisie did not pull the patch back. She kept her hand flat and steady, and she watched the dog breathe, and her expression was something that Avery, watching from 20 feet away, would spend years trying to describe and never quite reach. It was recognition. It was the face of a child who had spent 5 months unable to locate something she knew still existed somewhere, and had just found it in the last place anyone would have looked. Then Maisie spoke. Her voice had not been used in 5 months. It came out rough, low, cracked at the edges, barely above a whisper. In the fluorescent silence of the corridor, it was the loudest thing Avery had ever heard. "Echo out," Maisie said. "Echo out. You're home now." The breath left Gideon in a single audible exhale. He knew the terminology. 2 decades in military working dog operations had given him comprehensive knowledge of handler protocols, including the classified practice of personalized stand-down commands, terminal codes, designed to disengage the dog from operational mode when standard protocol had failed, passed between handler and animal outside of observation, in the private language that developed between an operator and a working dog over years of shared danger and proximity. These commands were never documented in standard service files. They existed only between 2 beings who trusted each other completely. Jace Pennell had given his daughter the key to the most precise instrument he had ever carried into combat. Wraith did not simply relax, he came undone. His front legs folded beneath him, and he went down onto the concrete with a heaviness that went beyond the physical. The sound of something that had been holding itself at maximum tension for 4 months finally, completely releasing. A sound came out of him that was not a bark and not a whine, and not anything in the behavioral taxonomy Gideon had spent a career building. It was the sound of a soldier who had been told, in the only language he could not disbelieve, that the mission was finished, that he was permitted to stop. He dragged himself forward on his belly until his head was against the bottom of the fence, as close to Maisie as the barrier would allow, and he lay there shaking. Avery was on her knees on the concrete before she decided to move. Her arms went around Maisie from behind, and her face pressed into her niece's hair, and she was shaking with something she couldn't have named, some compound of terror and relief and grief, so total it had no single word in any language she knew. Gideon stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then he walked to Kennel 7, took the secondary bolt in both hands, and opened the door. He was simultaneously violating 7 of his own facility protocols. He was aware of this. He opened the door anyway. Wraith crawled out. He did not bolt. He did not look at Gideon. He moved directly to Maisie and laid his scarred head in her lap, and the little girl put both arms around his neck and held on, and for the first time in 5 months she cried, not silently but out loud, messy and open and real, the way a child cries when they've been carrying something far too heavy for too long, and have finally found someone to help them put it down. "It's okay," she said into his fur. "Jace sent me, I've got you." They stayed in Fayetteville 2 days while Gideon processed the emergency transfer paperwork with a speed suggesting he had decided the regulations were someone else's problem. Wraith was calm in a way that quietly unsettled the entire staff. Not the flat, dissociated calm of a sedated animal, but the settled, watchful calm of a dog that had realigned itself around a new purpose. He stayed within 18 inches of Maisie at all times. He ate when she was present and not before. On the drive back to Knoxville, he sat in the back seat beside her. He did not watch the windows with the explosive hypervigilance that had defined his 4 months at Iron Ridge. He watched the road ahead, alert but unhurried, and every 40 minutes he would turn and press his nose briefly to Maisie's temple, as if verifying something, then look forward again. At home, he mapped the house in a single evening, systematic, room by room, unhurried but thorough. Every night afterward, he slept across the threshold of Maisie's bedroom door, positioned so that anyone entering would have to step over him. He did not appear to find this uncomfortable. He appeared to find it correct. 3 weeks after they returned from Fayetteville, Avery was at the kitchen sink washing dinner dishes when she heard Maisie's voice from the living room. Not the ragged, recovered whisper she'd had since the corridor, but something fuller, more every day, the way a voice sounds when it has remembered what it's for. She dried her hands and went to the doorway. Maisie was sitting cross-legged on the rug in front of the fireplace. On the mantel above her was the small memorial Avery had assembled for Jace, his folded flag, a photograph from his last leave, his challenge coin. On the rug in front of Maisie was Wraith's old deployment collar, the heavy ballistic nylon one that had come in the box from Iron Ridge. Avery had initially placed it on the mantel, but Wraith had made his objection to this arrangement clear within 2 days, standing in front of the fireplace, whining at precise intervals until she brought it down. He didn't wear the collar. He simply needed it at floor level, accessible, within reach, and he stood guard over it with an attention that seemed excessive for a piece of worn equipment. "There's something in it," Maisie said. She wasn't speaking to Avery specifically. She was speaking to the situation. "He keeps nudging it toward me. He wants me to look inside." Avery crouched beside her and picked up the collar. It was stiff with age and use, the nylon darkened in places, the hardware scratched from years of field work. She ran her thumb along the interior lining. She felt it immediately, a rigid seam that didn't match the original construction. Something flat and hard, and deliberately placed inside the layered nylon, sealed there by someone with access and intent, and not much time. Avery went to the kitchen for scissors. She came back and sat down on the rug with Maisie pressed against her side, and she cut carefully along the false seam and a small waterproof pouch. Military issue, the kind used for field documents in environments that didn't stay dry, slid out onto the carpet. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper, the tactical kind, gridded and water-resistant, the kind operators carried in the breast pockets of their plate carriers. Folded 4 times, Avery's hands were not steady when she opened it. The handwriting was Jace's. It was also not entirely Jace's, hurried, pressured, the letters crowding each other in a way his usual handwriting never did. He had always written with an unhurried precision that surprised people who only knew him as loud and fast. She read it aloud so Maisie could hear every word. Aves, Maze. If you're reading this, Wraith found his way to you. I ordered him to. I know how that sounds, but trust me that he understood completely. I took a bad one in the breach. The team medic is working, but the math isn't going the way I'd prefer. I'm writing this in the staging area while I still have full use of my right hand, which I am counting as a gift. I've been carrying this note since Mosul. I update it every deployment. I always believed I'd eventually get to throw it away because I'd made it home. I wanted badly to throw it away. Maisie, baby girl, you are the most extraordinary thing I have ever been close to. and I have been close to some astonishing things. You are braver than you know. When this is too hard, and it will sometimes be too hard, let Wraith carry some of it. That's what he was trained to do when I couldn't be there. He knows the command. You know the command. Tell him echo out when he needs to hear it, and then let him just be a dog for a while. He's earned it. So have you. Avery, you are the only person I have ever trusted completely. You already know everything I'd want to say. I don't have to say it. Thank you for knowing. There's a good moon over the ridgeline on clear nights. Look at it sometimes. I love you both more than the language has words for. J. Avery set the letter down on the rug. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Maisie reached over and picked it up very carefully, the way she had learned to handle things that mattered, and held it against her chest with both hands. Wraith moved from the threshold of the living room to the center of the rug. He laid himself down beside Maisie and pressed his warm flank against her side. He exhaled, long, slow, and complete, and for the first time since anyone at Iron Ridge had known him, his body carried no tension at all. Not the tension of readiness, not the tension of waiting. Nothing held in reserve, nothing braced for impact. Just a dog breathing quietly, finally beside the people he had crossed an ocean and survived 4 months of solitary confinement to reach. Maisie leaned against him. She stopped crying before Avery did, because she had always been the braver one, exactly like Jace said. Outside, through the back window, the ridgeline was dark against a clear sky, and the moon was exactly where her father had promised it would be.